Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. I'll be your moderator. My name's Amanda Card, and I'm an engagement analyst at SHARE, the Shareholder Association for Research and Education, and the program coordinator for the Committee on Workers' Capital, which is based here at SHARE. For the webinar this morning, Qatar Investor Responsibilities and Human Rights Risks in Construction, we will be getting started in a couple of minutes. I just wanted to introduce a few housekeeping items before we get going here. After the presentations are complete, we will open the floor to questions for the webinar. You can type questions into the control panel that you have on the right-hand side of your screens, and you can type them in any time as we go along. And at the end of the session, I will read the submitted questions for our panelists to answer. We have scheduled 1 hour for the webinar, and we are attempting to record the webinar. It doesn't always work, but we're hopeful that we'll get that chance. And we will share the speaker presentations to you after the webinar is complete in a message tomorrow. So today's webinar on investor responsibilities and human rights risks sector will begin with an account on the current situation of migrant workers in the construction industry in Qatar and the role and responsibilities of both companies and investors as defined by international norms and standards, including the UN Guiding Principles and the OECD Guidelines for Multinational Enterprises. There will be a presentation of the Business and Human Rights Resource Center's outreach to multinational construction companies operating in Qatar. And lastly, an overview of the international shareholder engagement effort that is being rolled out to mitigate human rights risks with Canadian and other multinational construction companies present in Qatar. And following the webinar, we invite investors interested in joining the engagement to contact my colleague Hugues. Now let me introduce our speakers today. First, we have Jin Suk Lee. Since 2010, Jin Suk Lee has been the global campaign director for the Building and Woodworkers International, BWI, a global union representing 12 million members in the building materials, wood, forestry, and allied sector in 135 countries based in Geneva, Switzerland. In her position, Jin Suk liaises and negotiates with construction companies present in Qatar on the implementation of BWI's 11 demands to ensure decent work for migrant workers in Qatar. She will present her work on this issue. And we also have joining us Annabelle Short, Program Director with Business and Human Rights Resource Center in New York City. She joined Business and Human Rights Resource Center in 2003, and she oversees the center's programs and communications work, manages its Asia and its Middle East researchers, and coordinates joint initiatives with Resource Center partners. Annabelle has led a new initiative contacting construction companies about their policies and practices regarding migrant workers in Qatar. This initiative will be expanded in 2016 to cover both Qatar and the United Arab Emirates. In her presentation, she will touch on the Resource Center's outreach to construction companies in relation to business and human rights mission and objectives. And also today we have Hugues Letourneau, who is an ESG analyst at SHARE here in Vancouver, Canada. He's also the program officer for the Global Union's Committee on Workers' Capital, whose secretariat is housed at SHARE. He joined SHARE in 2013, where he carries out research and engagement on social issues and coordinates initiatives with the global network of trade union-nominated pension fund trustees to foster responsible capital stewardship. Over the last 2 years, he's been building an extensive database on multinational companies in Qatar and has worked collaboratively with civil society organizations such as the ITUC and BWI, along with Business and Human Rights Resource Center, to increase disclosure and transparency around human and labor rights in Qatar. And Hugues will be presenting the case for investor engagement and will be highlighting how investors can carry out due diligence to mitigate the ESG risks in construction companies in Qatar. So we will first hear from Jin Suk, followed by Annabelle and Hugues, and I will get the presentation lined up here. And then hand it over to you, Jin Suk.
Okay, can people hear me? Okay, I'm assuming that you're going to, actually you can hear me. So I was asked by the shareholders or the organizers to really focus my presentation on our work on the ground. But I want to at least give people who are listening at least the strategic frame of our campaign that's on Qatar. And so you have the presentation in front of you. It's only about 6 or 7 slides because our campaign frame is around the 6 sort of major clusters. So our work in Qatar, as how we framed it, the No World Cup in Qatar Without Workers' Rights campaign, is actually a nexus of our two major global campaigns. One that focused on the sports campaign for decent work, which we initiated at in the beginning of the World Cup in South Africa in 2010. Where we saw the opportunity of using big mega sports events as to organize not only construction workers, but at the same time to ensure decent work standards in relation to mega sports events. And then, particularly in case in Qatar, the other major campaign that we see is in terms of the conversions is our global campaign for migrant workers' rights, mainly being in Qatar. As we know, 99% of the workforce in Qatar in construction are migrant workers. And the majority, obviously, are migrant workers. When we initiated the campaign, we noted that many are from, obviously, South Asia, but we see increasingly there's a large number that are coming from Southeast Asia. And from the missions that we have partaken in Qatar, we also see there's some increased numbers of migrants, particularly depending upon the skill, from African countries and in Southeast Europe as well. And our campaign is actually has what we would say 6 main clusters, but I will focus on maybe the first 3. Clearly for us, the priority is to build what we say a workers' base in Qatar. And this is obviously challenging, noting that migrant workers cannot join trade unions. But we have what we have done is since our first official mission in 2013 to the present, we have gone there several times, either officially or unofficially, to outreach to workers in the various work sites or labor camps in the communities. And from this, we've been able to not only develop leaders and contact persons, but we're actually been able to develop a network and associations of migrant workers. We're starting to organize them amongst community lines, and the process that we have is to develop a link of the workers with what we supposedly and put in quotation marks, branches of Qatar branches of our affiliates in the countries of origin. And a number of our affiliates in the country of origin, particularly India and Nepal, they actually have members who are working in Qatar. And it is through these members that we've actually been able to outreach more broadly. And since our 2013 official mission to now, we've actually been able to hold what we would consider post-arrival workers' rights seminars. And we've done it into 2 specific communities. One is the Filipino migrant workers, and then the second has been the South Asian migrant workers. In terms with the workshops and seminars that we've done with the Filipino migrant workers, we've actually have a collaboration with the Filipino embassy based in Doha. And so it's a joint partnership official workers' rights seminar where the labor attaché participates and gives a presentation and outline of what of the rights, what labor rights for workers and migrant workers in Qatar. In specifically also with the South Asian community, we've actually been working with a lawyer who's been able to give information as well as process of how to file complaints. And then in the process of the work that we have been doing, what we've noticed consistently is that the issues that migrant workers are consistently confronted with are issues based on back wages. That's one of the main issues that they have, and also issues about recruitment agencies who have indicated that they will get a certain amount per month as well as work hours. So what the contract that they sign with the country of origin differs in the country when they come to Doha. And then also the other main issue that many migrant workers have indicated that's a big problem for them is the dual contract. What it basically means is the contract that they sign in the country of origin is not recognized when they arrive in Qatar. They're made to sign new contracts which has different conditions, working conditions and wages. Of course, you all know about the issues of some of the living conditions. You've seen that, so I don't need to elaborate. We've seen, but much of the issues about the labor camp conditions are particularly what we found is with the subcontractors. Some of the main contractors that we've met, particularly the big companies who are doing construction projects in Qatar, we've been able to visit some of the labor camps, and it's what you would call decent, and actually, they're trying to improve them, but it's the issue around the subcontractors. So that would be actually in terms of the engagement that we have done with the construction companies. We have two basic things. One is that we have an 11-point demand that we've outlined for construction companies operating in Qatar, and the 11 points range from the issues around the kafala and exit visa system. Clearly, we understand that the kafala and the abolishment of the kafala and the exit visa system is not within the mandate of the construction companies, in the mandate of the Qatari government. However, we feel that the companies should agree to the no exit visas, no objections certificates regarding exit visas, and that's one of our key demands, as well as the not withholding passports or confiscating passports. And then, of course, the 11 demands also range around issues of safety and health, employment contracts, living quarters, as well as the main contract liability. I think what can be done later is that we could, Hugh or Annabelle could send our 11-point demands, but it's also on our website as well. And in terms of the official engagements that we have, actually, we've been engaging with Bessex, a Belgian company that's also responsible for the construction of the Khalifa Stadium, or the reconstruction or renovation of the Khalifa Stadium, one of the laying stadiums that will be built in Qatar, as well as we've been currently talking with Vinci, POR, Cellini, and some of the Spanish companies. In terms of Cellini and the Spanish companies like OHL, we have actually an international framework agreement, so that has been a good basis for us to have initial engagement. Cellini is important to us in terms of looking at future engagements, because they just won a contract recently for one of the stadiums, and they're also building currently one of the metro projects. Specifically with the companies, we not only have the 11 demands has actually been our basis to discuss signing of what we would call a compact that respects the rights of migrant workers in Qatar. And one of the key elements of that would be the issues around migrant workers being able to join, to establish workers' committees or workers' associations at the company level. So that's the key part of the engagement. And we've also actually talked to POR, which is an Austrian company. The third part I will touch on is our engagement around FIFA. Obviously, because FIFA is is critical in our engagement, because they're the sponsor of the World Cup, and we've have specific demands around FIFA, is that we encourage them to implement what we call the decent work stadiums and infrastructure standards policy, because as some of you know, FIFA has standards and policy around environment, around sustainability, and within this line we also are pushing for a decent work standards. And then another key element that we've also part of our discussions is with FIFA, which has been very limited, was around the joint labor inspections, which we had in the preparations for the South Africa World Cup. The big, I think, area that we move forward in terms of our push around FIFA is that we filed a complaint with the Swiss NCP against FIFA, stating that even though FIFA is supposedly a non-profit entity, that it falls within the guidelines, the OECD MNE guidelines, and the Swiss NCP in their initial assessments has said that there's they've agreed to with us. Actually, agreed is the wrong word because I have to be careful. They've declared that there's enough merit for the Swiss NCP to mediate or offer its services as mediation. The exact wording is actually in their initial assessment report, and the initial assessment report is on the website. And if people are more interested on the assessment report, I can provide that as well. And then, of course, our other areas of the campaign has been really targeting the Qatari government, as well as looking at the governments of the countries of origin, and then doing a massive communication media strategy that looks at both globally and at the national level. And in our campaign nationally, our affiliates, particularly in Sweden, in the Netherlands, in Germany, in Austria, has been very aggressive and very strong on the campaign supporter. And so I think one of the successes of our campaign, specifically targeting companies as well as the Qatar government and FIFA, has due to the participation and the initiatives of our national affiliates. So that would be the reason for much of the work that we've been able to do at the global level. So I'll stop here because I don't want to go beyond my 10 minutes. Is someone there?
Great, thanks so much, Jinsuk. That was very helpful. I'm still here, we're all still here. And I'm going to hand over now to Annabelle. Just 1 second while I switch over here.
Great, thank you.
And Annabelle, I will change to you. It's all yours, Annabelle.
Thank you. Excellent. So hopefully you can all hear me fine and can also see my screen up here. Let me just go back to the beginning, sorry. So I am the Program Director for Business and Human Rights Resource Center. We are an international non-profit with offices in London and New York, and then researchers based in 13 different countries. Our focus is on transparency, accountability, and empowerment in the area of business and human rights. Much of our work focuses on gathering stories about companies' actual human rights impacts on the ground and bringing those to an international audience that includes investors and others. We also have a company response mechanism whereby we seek public responses from companies to specific allegations of abuse, and our global response rate from companies to those allegations is 70%. We also recently have expanded to what you could describe as more proactive outreach to companies on specific issues. So one example is our Myanmar Foreign Investment Tracking Project, whereby we invite companies to respond to a tailored set of questions specifically about human rights due diligence in Myanmar. And then similarly, we launched earlier this year outreach to a group of around 25 construction companies operating in Qatar with a set of questions about their approach to managing the issue of migrant workers there. The full results and details about this outreach are available on our website. We can share the direct link later. The questions that we asked were developed in consultation with a range of organizations to try to capture the key issues. They range from the very basic, does the company have a social responsibility or human rights policy, to a very fundamental question, but that can be sometimes missed, on their precise nature of their operations in Qatar, through issues such as relationships with subcontractors that Jinsuk highlighted as a very important element of this earlier in her presentation, health and safety, conditions of employment, and that includes issues such as exit permits, passport retention, etc., ability to change employers, relationships with recruitment agencies, approach to freedom of association and how the company handles discrepancies between its international headquarters policies on that issue and the fact that in Qatar and most likely other countries in which it operates, freedom of association is not permitted, particularly for migrant workers, grievance procedures, public engagement, where we ask specifically for them to provide contact details for who people should be in touch with regarding the company's policies and practices in this area, engagement with the Qatari government, and challenges that the company is facing. Again, all of this is on our website, but just briefly so that you can see some companies have sent responses so far, which are all available in full, some in a lot of detail, some in less detail. Some companies declined to respond publicly, and then there are many that we're continuing to follow up with. One thing worth highlighting here is that, as you'll see, the majority of those that have responded are headquartered in Europe. We've had perhaps predictably more trouble getting Chinese or Middle East-based companies to respond. That said, we have had some indication from some companies, in particular one in UAE that's considering responding. So I definitely don't think that the door is closed. Another thing to highlight is that often companies might be in the process of providing a response, and somebody within the company, either somebody in charge of corporate responsibility or directly overseeing these issues, might write a very detailed response, but the challenge can come in getting it past the final sign-off in legal communications or elsewhere in terms of actually releasing it to the world. So there are at least 2 examples where we know that there are responses drafted there within the company but not yet publicly available. Just to give you a sense, this is how you can access the information at the moment on our website. So you can download the full response by a company. This is Vinci's. A few examples of the types of positive information that we have coming through is Vinci describing how previously the approach to passports is that workers would not be able to access them themselves, and now they can through having access to a personal safe, which I think is going to become more standard practice. But again, making it required standard practice and actually implementing it are often 2 different things. We also asked companies the question of which recruitment agencies do they regularly work with, and so far only the Greek company Actor has provided the specific names of the agencies and contact details at them. For those interested in this area, I know that New York University Stern Business School has started a big research project looking specifically at the whole recruitment agency sector and how that relates to the movement of migrant workers from South Asia through to the Middle East Gulf. Carillion in the UK highlighted, again, an issue that came up earlier that is very important for a lot of workers, the issue of contracts, saying we're currently implementing a new process to ensure all of our offers of employment employment contracts are provided to workers in a language they're able to understand. We will then work with our subcontractors to implement this practice into their recruitment processes. We will also introduce spot checks as part of our audit procedures to ensure compliance with this process and ensure the contracts are not changed upon arrival in Qatar. And one thing that I find reassuring in the tone of this and some of the other responses is the acknowledgement that things aren't going to be resolved overnight. There's a commitment to act and a recognition it takes time to implement these things. A very contrasting response was an email we received from Habtoor Leighton Group, headquartered in United Arab Emirates, saying the company has a very strict, and clear policy not to communicate on these issues. Interestingly, it also flags on its website, Habtoor Leighton, that it's part of the CIMIC Group, Australia's largest construction company, in which a major shareholder is Hochtief, the German company. We had contacted CIMIC Group in Australia, who then referred us for these questions to Habtoor Leighton. Likewise, we also received a response from the German company Hochtief to our questions, but they made it very clear that their answers related only to the projects that they directly had complete control over within Qatar, and separated in a way their responsibility from Habtor Leighton, even though CIMIC has a 45% ownership of Habtor Leighton. Likewise, Hochschief Spanish owner ACS referred us to the response by Hochschief. And I think this chain highlights some of the differences in approach by companies around their responsibility for joint venture projects within Qatar. Very briefly, looking ahead, as Hugh mentioned, in 2016 we'll be expanding the project. That's going to include continued outreach to construction firms, as well as some hotel companies operating both in Qatar and United Arab Emirates, an interactive database for the answers available, which will be available both in English and Arabic, related communications and media outreach, where available, and given the lack of civil society space within the region, this is somewhat limited, but complementing the company responses with specific concerns regarding conditions on the project sites, profiling of strong examples of good practice and leadership by companies. And actually in that light, one example that I'll just highlight here is Vinci, that was mentioned earlier, is conducting a human rights impact assessment at the moment, so a thorough look at what the main human rights risks are regarding its operations in Qatar. I think that's something very clear that can be expected of all construction companies, and analysis of the results. There is my contact information for anybody that wants further information, and I look forward to being in touch with you all ahead on this important issue.
Great, thanks so much, Annabelle. We'll move next right into Hugues' presentation. I wanted to mention quickly, though, that please do feel free to type in questions as we go along if they're coming up for you already, so we have them all queued up for the question and answer period. And so, Hugues, I'll give you control here and you can get going.
Great. Thanks very much, Amanda, and thanks everyone for taking a few minutes and joining us. I'm going to provide a brief overview of the human labor rights situation in Qatar, but to specifically touch in on what investors can actually do, which is what the research that I've been conducting has been focusing on in the recent years. So provide a brief case for the investor engagement, also provide a company mapping and benchmarking using some of the very useful data that Business and Human Rights has been accumulating and disclosing publicly. And of course, as investors will know, we are interested in publicly listed companies. So this is what I will focus on. How can investors perform their due diligence? What kind of questions they should be asking to companies? And I'm going to wrap up by talking about the steps that are currently being taken to do this. So I'm not going to go too much in depth here because it's already been touched, but a few key elements about why investors should pay attention to Qatar. The legal context, it's been highlighted. Foreign workers are subject to the kafala system, which links them to their sponsor, which is often their employer. At the international level as well, Qatar has not signed some important ILO conventions like ILO Convention 87 on the freedom of association. Some problems have been, of course, documented. We have cases of forced labor, a substantial rate of workplace-related injuries, and a very high fatalities rate. And I would also point your attention to a document and a web platform, actually that was just published yesterday by the International Trade Union Confederation, and you can find it pretty easily on the web if you click Qatar Exposed. And the size of the population at risk, Jinsuk made allusion to the fact that migrant workers constitute a very high fraction of the population. Scale of infrastructure development, this can be an interesting comparison here. $205 billion is being invested between 2014 and 2018. And I looked at some figures from the Canadian infrastructure spending by governments, different orders of government, both federal and provincial. And between 2009 and 2012, 25 billion was spent in joint federal provincial infrastructure. So this kind of gives you an idea of the scale of infrastructure development in Qatar, which is a very small country of 2 million people. So why look at Qatar specifically? We know that there's a similar context in other Gulf countries such as the United Arab Emirates or Saudi Arabia. But of course, the World Cup in 2022 has really amplified the amount of media attention that has been shined on the country. So now if we turn really to investor risks and responsibilities, there's of course a number of risks. We can mention, of course, the legal risks. Some experts have warned that criminal cases could be filed in host and home countries against companies and managers. And Annabelle was actually talking about Vinci. Vinci is also facing a probe before the French court system over the use of forced labor on construction sites in Qatar, and this was filed in April 2015. And this has actually had an impact if we transport ourselves to Canada. So of course this taints the company's reputation. And one thing that happened here in Canada is that Vinci won a public works contract in Saskatchewan, and there the cabinet minister responsible for the file said that should these allegations prove to be true, it could break its contract with the company. So a very tangible case of reputational risk here, which could inflict some financial consequences to the company. Very important as well is the country risk, and I think to highlight this example, I would point you to the Nyu Abu Dhabi Project, which is very interesting because NYU had really said that they wanted this project to be exemplary in terms of respecting workers' rights and human rights, but allegations came to light in 2014 about human and labor rights violations, and the UAE government actually commissioned a law firm, Nardello, to look into these claims. So some of the claims were that wages had been withheld, passports confiscated, workers had been deported as well because of some strike action, and the report actually found some loopholes that allowed companies to basically bypass the labor code of conduct. And the way this was done was that companies would actually fractionalize their contracts in smaller pieces so that they could actually escape application of the code of conduct. So this really underscores the complexities of the situation in countries where there's weak worker rights combined with loose corporate oversights. And it's also an additional case for why there are additional risks if company behavior goes unchecked. So this really justifies investor involvement in many ways. And I would just point also to the fact that the contractor on this project was a British firm, Carillion, which is active in Qatar as well. So what we found in terms of responsibilities is that the OECD guidelines really provide a good frame because they apply to the multinational companies that are active in Qatar. And as most of you will know, the guidelines also apply to minority shareholders. So investors really have a responsibility to use their leverage to prevent or mitigate adverse human rights impact from occurring on the ground in Qatar. Now, if we look at this table here, I've highlighted some companies which have won some important contracts in recent years. There's a very sort of broad geographic representation. If we look at Canada here, we have Brookfield Asset Management and SNC, which up to now at least have not responded to the business and human rights outreach. In terms of the employment footprint as well, we can see that it is quite substantial, just looking at Vinci, or if we go further down also and look at the UK companies, 10,000, and so it's all over in the thousands, basically. Grupo ACS, which we were referring to, which Annabelle referred to. And I think that one thing that's very important is to analyze how much responsibility multinational companies are willing to assume for their tier 1 suppliers, subcontractors. And this is one thing that the Business and Human Rights Outreach has really helped us do. If I turn to the next slide here. Oh, I'm sorry, it looks like I'm actually missing a slide, so I'll just make sure that that's up on the presentation that I send. But I basically compare the responses in terms of the passport policies of Carillion and Vinci. And just to read you Carillion, and to note that Carillion's policies was a little bit more risky in terms of risks of forced labor, because they actually allowed for the company or the managers to retain the passports of employees. And the reason for that is the following. So I quote, "All of our people have the right to retain their own passport in line with Qatar law, unless they expressly request in writing for us to hold it for them. Often this works out to be a safer and more secure option, so many of our own employees do request this." In contrast, Vinci, as Annabelle was highlighting here, had the following response. So I quote again, "Workers now have a personal safe in their own room cabinet to securely hold onto their passports." So we really see that in the latter case, there is a better mitigation of risk of passport confiscation and forced labor situation. And then if we go further in terms of looking at the supply chain as well, in terms of how much analysis or how much, sort of responsibility the contractors are willing to assume, then the Vinci response here is much more comforting. I had also highlighted that Grupo ACS has actually not exactly responded to the Business and Human Rights outreach. So in this case, we have a pretty substantial transparency gap. So how can investors remedy to this? Well, you can see on this slide there's actually 6 demands that we have come up with, which investors can easily ask for. And one of them is also to ask companies to carry out an independent human rights impact assessment. And in this case, investor endorsement can actually accelerate the process, because it has started at Vinci, but from speaking with different people, it's actually a process that could actually move along much more quickly if there was sort of an investor angle that accelerated the implementation of the human rights impact assessment. And of course, human rights impact assessments are also prescribed under the UN guiding principles for business and human rights. Where do we stand now? Well, we have active contact points to engage with companies in the UK and in Canada. So if you would like, of course, I'm going to be able to share this presentation, and you can have a look at the list of companies. And the next step would be to look at the joint investor letter that we have drafted and that has obtained the backing from a number of investors. And next we're going to be looking at sending out the letters, hopefully by the end of November, and engaging in a dialogue with the companies over the demands. So what can you do if you're interested in obtaining more information? Well, you can very easily contact me at the email address below. So thanks very much, everyone, and very much look forward to your questions.
Great. Thanks so much to all of our panelists for their illuminating presentations. So I want to use this remaining time to get right into some questions. So as we've noted, please do submit your questions via the control panel on the right-hand side of your screen here. I'm just going to switch back over. Okay, and to start out, we've got a few already lined up. This first one, I'm just going to make sure I actually unmute all of our speakers. This first question comes for the first presentation for BWI, so it'll go to you, Jin Suk, and it's just asking specifically for the spelling of these companies. But I think what this gets to is the fact that many of our participants would be interested in the list of companies that BWI is engaging. So is that something that you have available?
Yeah, yes, I mean, sorry, it was, so we have been in discussions with Vinci. So it's the same company that both Annabelle and Hugo had mentioned. We've also been in discussions with Bessex, which is a Belgian company, Pour, an Austrian company, and Cellini Impregilo, an Italian company, and then of course a number of Spanish company, OHL, who has a project there in Perioval. But I can send, I don't know, I mean, it's on our website, the list of these companies too.
Great.
Does
So
that
that's
help?
yeah, that's something that we can send around to the full group afterwards too. So that's very helpful.
Mm-hmm.
And the second question ties into both the BWI and the Share presentation. So the question is, how do the investor demands proposed by Share compare to the 11-point set of demands mentioned by BWI? Maybe I'll have you both address that one.
Yeah,
Hugues,
well, here, yeah, I can take this one. So this is Hugues. The demands that Share has come up with have been developed actually in a collaboration with a number of international trade unions, including, of course, BWI. So they are very much sort of inspired from the BWI 11 demands. We've chosen 6. Because we thought it was just easier to approach companies with 6 demands than with 11, but they definitely are not mutually exclusive, and they sort of only reinforce basically what BWI would be asking for. And I think one thing to remember is that, and Jinsuk can talk to this effect, BWI is not necessarily engaging with all of the companies that are publicly listed, all the multinational companies that are publicly listed and that are active in Qatar. And this is a place where investors could sort of step in and send the questions along with the demands to the companies.
Yeah. No, I mean, Hugh is completely right. He and I have been in discussions, and we have been collaborating. So there is a synchronicity or in sync or convergence, I think, of the two. And he is completely right in terms of the companies, of the outreach of Share, and then our companies. Much of the engagement we have done actually has been with the European companies, and this has to do with the fact that we have international framework agreements with some of these European companies, but it doesn't mean that our future engagement will stop from just the European companies. We're actually currently in discussions with our South Korean affiliate, who is very much interested in looking at the presence and operations of South Korean companies. And there's clearly a number of South Korean companies that is operating in Qatar, so we're in discussions with them as well. And then in terms of the specific issues, I mean, there is the conversions clearly around the issues of the employment contracts, as well as wages and decent and safe accommodations and the dispute system. The reason we have 11 demands is because if all of you who are listening, if you're football fans, you know that there are 11 players. So as from a campaign, organization, we wanted to highlight that as 11 players in a football team, we have 11 demands. So that is the reason behind our 11 demands.
That's great. I like the strategy behind that. Okay, the next question that I've got here is, we're wondering how much scope do multinational construction firms have to improve treatment of workers if the core of the problem lies with the legal regime in place in Qatar? Maybe Annabelle, do you want to start in on that one?
Sure. I think a couple of points I would make is that while the legal regime in Qatar is pretty restrictive, the conditions and the approaches at the moment often actually fall short of it. So what a lot of organizations say is that at a minimum, you know, if companies are actually adhering to the Qatari labor law, many of them would be doing more than what they're doing now. I'd also say that it's a situation that, you know, it's not unique to the construction sector. We've seen it in so many sectors whereby their international policies may conflict with local laws, the situations on the ground. So given international standards such as the OECD guidelines on multinational enterprises, and given the UN guiding principles on business and human rights that essentially set an international baseline of expected conduct of companies. Most multinationals should do, or certainly should realize by now, that when local laws and local circumstances fall short, that certainly does not let them off the hook in terms of finding ways to ensure that they're treating workers as fairly as possible. That can involve a certain amount of creativity, such as in areas where freedom of association for migrant workers is not allowed, ensuring that at a minimum workers have access to worker-led health and safety committees, for example. Also, finally, I'd say we can certainly see already differences in approach by the different companies operating in the region. So those that are taking a lead, and even they would certainly say they're not getting it all right, provide a very strong example for others to follow. And once those leadership examples are identified, then of course it's much easier to make the case to others that, you know, look, so and so and so and so are managing to do this, why aren't you?
Great. Anyone want to add anything to that?
Well, actually, Amanda, can you point back to my screen? Actually, I found that missing slide that I wanted to present.
Certainly.
And that can actually, there we go. So yeah, for that one, I would definitely say that again, the OECD guidelines clearly say that a company's first responsibility is to respect domestic laws, and that in some cases where domestic laws and the spirit of the OECD guidelines conflict, then companies should do what they can to uphold the spirit of the guidelines. And I think that if anything, the business and human rights outreach has allowed us to see that some companies are doing a little bit more than others. Of course, it's harder to say with companies that have not disclosed their responses, because sustainability reports, as most of you doing some sustainability analysis will know, rarely provide a really good sort of country breakdown of what is occurring, and it can be very hard to track these days with companies operating in dozens or even sometimes hundreds of countries. But if we use the responses which have been made public by the companies, we can sort of use that and leverage them in their performance. And again, here I would point you to Vinci and Carillion, who have faced a substantial amount of public pressure, but we see even the supply chain due diligence, how much responsibility Vinci is willing to assume, is still a little bit superior to what Carillion is doing. And given that some gaps have been highlighted with regards to Carillion in Qatar in the UAE, we could certainly hope that the company, if it was to know that Vinci was actually doing a little bit more, would be willing to improve their own corporate standards. And I think that there is actually an argument to be made here that investors can help sort of put that positive pressure on companies.
Great. I think that is a good, I'm glad you're able to add that extra slide in, because I did find that one quite compelling. Maybe we'll send off to the next question here. Forced labor is a very serious allegation. Can you say a bit more about the specific practices that constitute forced labor? What is the first thing a company should do to ensure that none of its subcontractors engage in forced labor practices? Jinsuk, do you want to take a first?
Well, I'm thinking about it. You know, I think what's important to point out here is that the concept of forced labor, the very notion of the kafala system, where workers cannot freely change employers, and the fact that they cannot leave Qatar without the permission of their employers. That's a critical element in which they don't have freedom of movement and freedom of changing its employees. So if their employer, you know, it's not even in terms of the degrees of exploitation, where it's very where they're abused physically, or let's say that even if their wages are not paid adequately, and they have no choice of, and they have no recourse of changing employers, or no recourse to easily leave the country. And then I think those are conditions that are deemed around what we have considered, say, as forced labor. So this is clearly an important part, and this is one of the issues that we talk to some of the main contractors and say that it is the issue of the main contractor liability. I mean, we've talked to some of the main contractors like Salini, Impergilio, and Bessex. They have said that any of its workers who they employ, if they wish to leave, in terms of the exit visa, they have no, they sign that. And there's no objection to the exit visas. But if from a subcontractor, they are not, that's a different, they've never said that to us, but that's a different in terms of employment relationship. So the main contractors, we also encourage them and state that they're also liable as a main contractor because they have the subcontractors. So the importance, I think, in terms of subcontract, whether it's forced labor, whether it's issues around living quarters, it's the main contractor liability for the main companies. And that's the angle that we have pushed when we're discussing with the main contractors around the main points that we're pushing in Qatar.
Yeah, I think if I can add a few words, I think it's important as well to recognize that, you know, if there are over 1 million migrant workers in Qatar, there's a reason for that. A lot of these people are looking for better economic opportunities, right? A lot of them are coming from India, from Nepal, and the reason why they go to Qatar is that they think that they can make more money than they would make staying at home. So, you know, they are consenting basically to going to Qatar, and it's when they arrive there and on the ground they realize that what they had signed up for is not what they're actually finding in reality. In terms of forced labor, though, I am not a lawyer, but I have read a number of credible reports from organizations like Amnesty International, which conducted this analysis. They did the work, they did the interviews, and they clearly wrote that there were situations of forced labor. Confiscating passports is a situation that can constitute forced labor, and there's been, you know, a number of these cases that have been documented in Qatar. So it is definitely a problem on the ground.
Yeah.
I'd also go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Also, just to flag that obviously I think it's an issue, the issue of subcontracting and subcontracting that's pervasive in the construction industry. Obviously, not only in Qatar, I think, you know, Malaysia is another country with a booming construction sector where you really see a lack of accountability going down the chain when a subcontractor might contract to somebody else who contracts to somebody else, and it really does make enforcement and identification of responsibility challenging, but still not unimportant. Also interesting to look at approaches in other sectors, and I think that the issue of responsibility around this and what can be expected from companies is going to become clearer and clearer in coming years. Interesting in the electronics sector, for example, that I think it's Apple that now reports publicly on the instances in which it was found that workers at its suppliers paid fees for their jobs, and it actually said, they actually report, you know, last year we repaid X amount in fees that had to be paid by workers, or X amount of fees were repaid. So as always, there's sort of an area of specificity, which is really where the reality comes through, where you can see the differences between what companies are doing or not doing. It's also obviously easy for companies to say, and increasing numbers do, particularly in other sectors, we have a no fees policy and our subcontractors are expected to adhere to it. It's obviously another thing to ensure that they are adhering to it and to take action if they're not. So I think that's also an area where investors can provide a lot of extra leverage and inquiry in terms of saying, great, you've got this policy, we congratulate you for it. Now please can we have some examples of where it's being enforced, some real practical examples that help, if not to verify it, at least to give it teeth.
Yeah,
Annabelle?
I think, sorry, I think Annabelle hit the key element, which is the enforcement and the implementation of supposedly rules that that companies have in place to ensure fair practice and ensure that there's no practices of forced labor throughout the whole production, the whole subcontractor, the chain. And so the important part is to ensure that the companies actually follow through on its policy. And this is the area clearly where investors, as well as consumers, can push.
Yeah, my last point on that would be the issue of consumers, actually, exactly, because construction firms are not necessarily
Only construction, yes.
consumer facing as electronic firms like Apple would be. So this is why we need to be sort of creative in terms of the angles that we utilize to approach companies. Of course, we have Jinsuk here working for trade unions, and that's why investors can also be a very important angle to ensure that companies are effectively accountable.
I want to thank all three of you for figuring out how to wrap us up on the exact topic that I was hoping we'd finish on, which is why investor action is warranted. So thanks to all of you for your presentations and to all of our participants for joining us as well. We will, as we've mentioned, share all these resources afterwards so you can find out more. But as you saw, many of our presenters shared their contact information as well. So if you do have follow-up questions or would like to get involved in this engagement, please do get in touch with Hugues at Share. And also Annabelle shared her information. So you can get in touch with more questions there, and thank you everyone for your time today. We're going to end the webinar now on time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.